Yo, what's going on, everybody? This is Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, aka I've got a Bidoof deck ready for you that's pretty spicy. I like what it's doing so far for me, but I wanted to take a little bit of a break from like these top tier meta decks that we all kind of recognize and understand are very, very good. And I want to talk a little bit about that before we get into the Bidoof deck. So with that being said, let's get to it. Before we get into the deck, I just kind of wanted to take a quick snapshot of what the current meta looks like. And as always, I try to keep you guys informed with tournament data and kind of, just the top tier players and some of them, their opinions and some of the decks that they're playing. And honestly, I had heard about this Executor deck, and if you've been watching my content, I've been talking about Executor for probably around two and a half weeks now, since the new set came out. And even before then, we were all pretty aware that Executor EX on curve is just very hard for a lot of decks to deal with, and a lot of the time the best answer is to just try to get rid of the egg before it evolves. So what we're seeing this week and what we've been seeing for the past week or so, it really makes sense as the meta starts to develop that, hey, there's a lot of good dark types, but hey, Executor is still really, really good, especially when you have that weakness going for it. Some of the other decks, again, just kind of make a lot of sense. You've got obviously Charizard, which is really good into the grass decks because of its potential to just sweep with Charizard. And also, it's pretty chunky, right? When you take a look at Charizard EX, it can have as many as 200 HP when you talk about adding a giant cape to it, and that's very difficult for a lot of decks to deal with. Then you get the Darkrai Magnezone, the Darkraker Ninja, the Marshadow Magnezone, and again, all those decks I've talked about on here. Definitely check out some of my other videos that will be popping up at the end of this video if you want to learn more about them, or maybe check out some gameplay on them. As far as tier 3 and tier 4, and again, like honestly, I would classify all those decks as being like able to win a tournament. Even when you get to tier 3, Palkia EX can high roll, Gyarados EX can definitely do some damage, Pachirisu EX can win some of these smaller tournaments as we've seen in that 18 trainer deck, and then you've got the Weavile, Darkrai, and you get the Lucario, the Skarmory, Aggro, the Executor EX, which should probably be categorized into the Serebii EX, but hey, maybe they're just like taking out some of the extra cards that can be in there, and then you've got a little bit of filler here. But again, this video is going to be more centered around Bidoof, so let me show you the deck and let's check out some gameplay. This is the deck that I've currently been cooking with when I decided to start playing Bidoof, and just to kind of give you a little bit of game theory behind the deck as you kind of watch some of the gameplay. The whole idea is that I wanted to find decks that are one prize decks but can also break the mechanics of the game. Now, what do I mean by breaking the mechanics of the game? So whenever you talk about Pokemon trading card game, it's pretty well known that you can attach 1 energy per turn unless you have a mechanic that breaks that rule, and that's where a card like Manaphy comes in. And so Manaphy is going to be a 2-of in this deck, and as you've seen in many other decks, most notably I think Jeff Hoagland did a video and a deck where he played Yanmega in Manaphy and took advantage of that colorless attack. And so we're kind of basically thinking, hey, we can do that same theory in a lot of other decks, and we can play one prizers. That way, we don't get caught basically, in a compromising position where we give up an EX knockout and then all of a sudden, we have no chance to fight back. Now, the other alternative with Manaphy would be a card like a Dialga EX, and although Dialga EX does different things, like for example, if you open just Manaphy and all you see is Manaphy for like your first 2 or 3 turns, that is like game losing. But if you have just Dialga, there is a chance that, hey, maybe Dialga can actually be a tank and end up dealing 100 damage to knock out some critical Pokemon on your opponent's side of the field. So like that is something to definitely keep in mind. But again, like I wanted to mitigate that EX issue, and also Manaphy is just straight up faster than Dialga, so that's another reason why I wanted to fool around with Manaphy. And then also, you might be able to find some good synergy with water Pokemon as opposed to the steel type. Whereas in the steel type, you're mostly limited to stuff that's just colorless attackers when you pair it with Dialga, or you have to play something like a Skarmory. And then you get into deck issue spaces because you need the tools, but you also need all these other supporters to go ahead and play in the decks, stuff like Cyrus, stuff like Sabrina, so that way, you know, you can take advantage of your opponent whenever they decide to pivot out. So the other cards in this deck, you've got the double Bidoof, and the Bidoof is the way that you take down giant HP Pokemon, and you can be a little bit aggressive with them very early in the game potentially. So stuff like Gyarados, which you'll see a clip of Gyarados later on in the play video to the right side of the screen. But even when you start talking about cards like Executor EX, you know, they're going to be able to put pressure on Bidoof right away, and if they flip heads, you know, you're probably losing. But you know, again, like, this deck is not meant to just like go out there and, you know, immediately like beat every tier 1 deck. You're going to have solid matchups and be able to win matchups, but the honest truth is the power level of some of these other cards in the metagame right now are just very strong and hard to deal with. And that's something that a lot of people have been talking about in my comments, and I've even seen some of the discourse in Discords and in Twitter that, you know, a lot of people are kind of unhappy with the metagame, and that's why I think it's important to cook up decks like this. And it reminds me of like how I felt with Pidgeot EX and Fighting Box last format, where it just gave me something that's a breath of fresh air. And when I look at this deck, I also noticed, you know, you've got the double line of Greninja to pair with the one Barrel, which actually comes in handy a lot of times. And the reasoning behind the Greninja line is, well, obviously you can attack with it because you are playing water energies, so you can attack with Greninja to finish things off, but also there's going to be some times where you have Bidoof and you're able to take away half of your, you know, your opposing Pokemon's HP, but you need to basically snipe it with Greninja and then, you know, hit it with Barrel sometimes. And that's a lot of HP that you're dealing, right? So there's a lot of good synergy between what Barrel and what Bidoof do to combine with what Greninja can do. And so Greninja can be a little bit of a finisher and a closer, but it also seals the deal in a lot of matchups where maybe you wouldn't have been able to finish something off. Now, maybe, you know, you could say, hey, Spiritomb could do the same thing, but you know, you're using your attack when you do that. Whereas with Greninja, you're using your ability. But you know, the ideal opening hand or the ideal starter is, you know, Manaphy in the active, Bidoof on the bench, and, you know, Froakie on your bench as well. And hopefully you're able to evolve that Froakie up to a Greninja over the span of the next 2 to 5 turns if you end up going that long. And the thing is, you know, you're playing one prizers, so you know, you are okay with kind of sacking the Manaphy in the hopes of ramping to a good attacker. And the other thing about Manaphy here is you can actually afford to retreat it and deny the prize and go into one of your other Pokemon because, you know, you don't need to ramp as much as, say, you would need to with a Palkia EX or, you know, some of those giant tankier Pokemon, right? Like, you need one turn of ramp with Manaphy a lot of the time, and after that, you know, you should be good for the rest of the game, unless, you know, hey, you end up doing another pivot mid-game and needing to ramp a little bit. Now, when we talk about the trainers and the supporters, I do have a split of 1 Leaf and 1 X speed, and I could see somebody playing around with that, maybe playing double Leaf, but you know, the way that I look at it is Leaf is really good for when you get stuck with Bidoof or Barrel in the active and you have to pivot out into your Manaphy or into your Greninja, so that way you're not just losing all that momentum with the energies. The other thing that I look at with X speed is that it is a item card, so that allows you to have that synergy where you play supporter like a Cyrus or like a Sabrina, and then you X speed, or even, you know, those turn ones where you Professor's Research and then you draw the X speed, you pivot out of the active into your Manaphy, like say it's a Froakie, right? So there's a lot of cool synergies there. Then when you get to the rest of the supporters and the trainers, you've got 1 Cyrus, 1 Sabrina. I went with a 1-1 split because I found that sometimes I'm not able to get off to as an explosive as a start as I want, and Sabrina helps me kind of either bring something from their bench to the active, or it can help me play a little bit defensive sometimes as I try to get another turn to find my Manaphy or to find a piece of my Greninja line. And so that's a big reason why I do play that 1-1 split. Now, Cyrus is still great, and it is a big finisher for this deck. Now, the obvious picks in here are the double research and the double Pokeball. I won't spend too much time on that, but you also do have one Pokemon communication to help you try to fish for your missing Greninja line, or in one of the games you'll see fish for even something like a Barrel. Now, some of the big weaknesses that you'll run into with this deck are going to be cards like Skarmory. Skarmory with a tool, especially if they go second, is going to be very tough to overcome unless you're able to soak damage on a Bidoof and then leaf out of the active and, you know, get your Manaphy in. But even then, like, your Manaphy is just going to be one shot. So that's one of those cards that if you see that in your opponent's deck list, if you're playing in a tournament, or if you see that, you know, in the random queues, you're feeling a little bit sad, okay? The other cards that are pretty obvious are stuff like Executor EX on curve, right? Like, again, and that just kind of goes back to the idea that every card, or just about every deck in the game struggles with Executor EX on curve. And if they flip heads, obviously you're in trouble, because a lot of your stuff is going to get one shot, even if you're able to evolve into a Frogadier. So again, Skarmory and Executor EX is very tough. The cards that you don't mind seeing are stuff like Dredagon. There's a cool interaction with Bidoof and Dredagon where basically Bidoof, it doesn't deal damage, it just halves the damage on your opponent. So you actually don't take any residual damage or, you know, any of that recoil from Dredagon by using Bidoof to start chipping into it. Then you can potentially get into those moments where your Greninja could finish off the Dredagon, and now they have to bring something else into the active. Now, sometimes you're going to be forced to take a line where you play Bidoof against a Dredagon. You have their HP, and then you evolve into Barrel and you KO the Bidoof, or you KO the Dredagon. Okay, because the Barrel does do 60 damage, which does come up a lot. And you know, some of the other cards that you may run into, stuff like Moltres, you don't mind seeing Moltres because, again, that gives you time to set up your Manaphy, and then you can get that Moltres cut in half and then potentially KO it very early with the Barrel. And, you know, a lot of the time you just kind of have to pay attention to when do you need to play your Barrel. Are you better off just using your Bidoof first before you go into Barrel? And that's kind of one of those things that you learn as you play the deck. The other random things that pop up is sometimes you're attacking with Frogadier for 30 damage, and that's just something that could potentially finish off something that you hit with Bidoof, right? And, you know, when you take a look at this deck, it's, again, I reiterate, it's full of one prizers, so you really can't be afraid to kind of sack things. The other point that I kind of want to bring up that kind of is pretty pertinent to the metagame right now is that we have a lot of cards that are what I would kind of refer to as like snowball cards. And so what do I mean by snowball cards? They're cards that if you don't answer them immediately, it snowballs into a bigger problem. And that's essentially what Manaphy is. That's what Moltres is. That's what Dialga is. That's what a lot of these cards that kind of ramp are, right? Like, if you don't deal with them in a timely manner, they have the potential to snowball just out of control, and all of a sudden you're in a losing position where you can't really come back. And so that's sort of, you know, I don't want to say that's exactly what we're doing with this deck, because honestly, you know, Manaphy is not going to snowball crazy in this deck. The times that you're going to really have a lot of success with this deck are when you're able to actually find your Greninja line, find your Manaphy, and find your Bidoof. But, you know, obviously, you know, there are going to be times where, hey, they just come out really aggro with, like I said, those Skarmories, those Executors, and you get kind of put on a clock. But again, you don't mind seeing stuff like Dialga EX in their active. You don't really mind seeing big giant HP Pokemon like Gyarados if they don't hit their Misties or they take a time to ramp it up, because you're going to have time to get your Bidoof online, and then from there you're able to really take advantage of, you know, the fact that they can't pressure you back. So again, like, there's some cool synergies. with this deck. It's really fun to play. Again, I wouldn't say that there's any chance that this deck goes and wins, an Ursi Day tournament or any of the big tournaments, but it gives you an opportunity to see that, hey, there's potential that you can still, play some different things that maybe haven't been explored. I even tried to explore a little bit with Combi, and honestly, like, it's just bad. Like Combi, you have a limited bench space as it is. You have a limited time when Combi is good, and then it doesn't really break the mechanics of the game, right? Like, breaking the mechanics of the game is something that Manaphy, Gardevoir, Moltres, like, these cards do very well, and that's why they've had good success in tournaments and in the regular random queue. So again, like, when you're trying to assess cards, definitely look at stuff like that. And even when you're in rough situations, like the game that you're watching right now, like, this game looks just straight up lost, right? But there's actually some outs, because I do have the ability to have their I believe this is a Cranidos, right? I have the ability to have their Cranidos, and I still have the potential to draw into stuff like Greninja line, and I have that Pokemon communication in my hand. And so as you take a look at this game state, like, if they play Rampardos, obviously it gets a little bit murky, because again, I won't really have a follow-up, especially if they play it like right now and just immediately smack my Bidoof. But there's a potential where, hey, even what if I draw a Barrel and they're not able to evolve? Okay, so they didn't evolve. So now what I'm looking at here is I have Pokemon communication. If I draw any Pokemon, I have a chance to I think it's like a 1 in 5 at this point to hit the Barrel off of Pokemon communication. So I ripped the Pokeball, and even though this situation looked terrible, I'm down 2 points. They're playing a 1 prize deck. They gave me a small window of opportunity. The ramp that Manaphy gave me earlier in the game is going to be really, really, solid, because it's going to give me the potential to fight back. I end up getting the Barrel off of the Pokemon communication. Now I can threaten both of their Pokemon, because 60 damage will take care of not only the Cranidos, but also the Chateau. So even if they, end up coming back and putting another Fossil on their bench, I'm still going to have opportunities to maybe even find my Greninja line and extend the game a little bit longer. They're going to need to find Fossil, Cranidos, and Rampardos within like the next turn, right? And so again, even when situations look bad, because you're playing cards that kind of break the mechanics of the game, cards like Bidoof is an oddity, right? It's just something that, honestly, it's very close to being very game breaking. Like, if it took them down to 20 HP or 10 HP, obviously the card would be busted, but instead it takes it down to half. But as you can see on the situation on the right, I'm going to be able to seal this game with an attack from Barrel, and that's another good example of why you should play at least one Barrel in your Bidoof decks, because it does open up those opportunities. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the deck. I hope you enjoyed the gameplay on the side and a little bit of insight into the meta, and that'll wrap it up. In conclusion, I really thank you for taking time out of your day for me to be background noise, or maybe some entertainment, or hey, maybe you learned something over that commentary of, the current state of the game. And honestly, I understand that the game can be a little frustrating right now with the trading situation and obviously the state of the metagame for some people. But I would just say, hey, find your joy in the game. Don't feel like you have to play the game like it's a daily chore or something. Just find your joy in the game and really try to just do more of that. And as we get closer and closer to the end of the month and what we anticipate may be another mini set hitting the game, just know that we're gonna be right back here, cooking up more decks when that mini set comes up and having even more fun with more cards. Now, what can the mini set do to really maybe address some of the things in the game? I think the number one thing that I would look at is an ability blocker, something maybe like an item card that blocks abilities, maybe a supporter that blocks abilities for a turn, all that for just one turn, right? Unless you play multiple in consecutive turns. I don't know that Pokemon would be a good idea to block abilities, in terms of like a basic or a stage 1 that blocks all abilities. I don't know that that's a good thing, but I think that items or supporters could be something that could freshen up the game and maybe kind of change the way that some people are approaching the game. And again, like, cards have the ability to get better later on in the game. And, you always got to keep that in mind. So don't ever, necessarily feel like it's a chore. Don't feel like everything is, going downhill. I do think that the game is still really fun, and you just kind of have to find your joy in it, right? But as always, thank you so much. And I look forward to chatting with you guys and talking to you guys more in the comments. So make sure to leave your comment, leave a subscribe, if you haven't subscribed already, and leave a like. And until next time, I'll catch you later. Peace.